This is on the Worldview investigation. I placed this item on the agenda back in January, and then after that meeting, I was told that there would be an investigation. It would take anywhere from 3 to 6 months. Mr. Huckelberry sent out some preliminary information back in February, and so here we are, 6 months later. I put it back on the agenda to get the results of the investigation, and apparently this investigation was completed in May. It appears based upon the documentation, but the results of that investigation were never distributed to my office. And there was even a memorandum from Mr. Voorhees to Mr. Huckelberry from July 31st, which was in response to my placing this on the agenda. And I didn't see that any of the other supervisors were copied, so here we are today, and that's the reason this is on the agenda. We were notified in the August 1st memorandum that the insurance payout has been upped from the original estimate of $200,000 to $475,000. And my questions start with the fact that in the material it said that Worldview contacted the FAA, but there was nothing else in there. Did the FAA say, we're not going to investigate? Did the FAA say, we're not interested? There's nothing in there that says what the FAA's response was to Worldview. So that's my first question. Because typically the NTSB does the investigation, the FAA has the enforcement authority from everything that I read. And the NTSB does not travel typically to the scene unless there's a death, is what I read in the material. And the FAA was contacted, but there's absolutely nothing in the documentation, nothing in the report about any comments, anything at all from the FAA.
Mr. Huckelberry.
Yes, Mr. Chairman and Supervisor Miller. First, the issue of the money, $200,000 versus $475,000. If you go back and read my original memorandum, it said that we received the first check from the insurance company. It did not imply that the limit of damage is $200,000.
Well, that's what the estimate was at the time. That's what people,
No,
that's what was reported that it was.
Well, someone jumped to the conclusion. We said we've received the first check and that we would expect
Okay.
other
Well,
costs.
now it's $475,000.
And it's $475,000. Even if it was an estimate, it's like taking your damaged car into a repair shop after it's been in an
Right.
accident.
Right.
The final cost is
go
what
up
the
or
final
down.
cost is. Yeah. And the comment that I made about being superficial, if you look at the definition of superficial, it says on the surface. And so if you then think about the cost of this facility being $13.5 million and that the total damage cost is $475,000, that's 3% of the construction value. That is superficial. We've also had, and I assigned John Voorhees from my office to basically coordinate all of the reviews that are occurring by all of the various federal agencies, including Worldview. And I think Mr. Voorhees can report on the FAA and NTSB and others who may have been involved in or contacted in what they chose to do with regard to this investigation.
Mr. Voorhees, before you answer, I'd like to ask a question. Because there's been some inferences this morning during call to the public, and I'm concerned about it. But I'm going to ask, did Worldview follow all the proper procedures with FAA and any other federal agencies that would have had oversight over this kind of mishap?
Mr. Chairman, in my estimation, as far as I understand, Worldview followed all FAA regulations and all NTSB notification requirements for the incident.
I noticed that earlier in this discussion, there was a question about passenger-type vehicles and explosions. This wasn't a passenger-type vehicle, was it?
Correct, and this is also not a launch procedure investigation, which
Correct.
would be under a different type of investigation. In this case, what was investigated and how it was investigated was clearly by all FAA regulations.
Thank you, Mr. Voorhees.
Mr.
Please
Chairman?
continue with your answer.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask my question again?
Oh, sure.
There was no response from the FAA included in the documentation that was supplied to the board. The only thing it said was they did contact the FAA. Do we have any documentation from the FAA?
Mr. Chair, Supervisor Miller, we do not have any documentation. Via phone call, I talked with the Worldview staff. It is my understanding, they told me that their chief technical officer made a phone call to the FAA's operations center, which is standard protocol. The FAA declined to investigate the incident. It is not uncommon for the NTSB to also decline an incident of this type of magnitude.
So the FAA actually declined to investigate this explosion.
I would have to say that's my understanding because I was not part of the conversation, but...
That would be nice information to get clarity on whether or not the FAA even, because we don't even know based on what we've been given. We're taking somebody's word
Absolutely.
that they contacted the FAA, and it would seem to me they'd send out something from the FAA and either say the incident's too insignificant for us to bother, but it was a hydrogen explosion by an airport and by Raytheon. And so that really disturbs me that we have no documentation here whatsoever from the FAA. Nothing, except now and there's nothing in here that even says, Worldview says, it's just they were contacted. It doesn't say what their response was. Did we leave them a voicemail? Did we talk to some live body? What was the question? And I think a lot of people in this community have questioned and unease about that. I know I do. I have a lot of friends and family that work in that area. So, and without an official independent investigation, because my understanding is Worldview paid these 3 individuals who are, most of them are retired NASA engineers. They paid them to do this investigation. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, or Supervisor Miller, I'm not exactly sure whether they were paid or not. It would be my assumption that they would have been paid for their expertise and for their time, but I was not involved in the contractual negotiation for that independent investigation.
Ms. Dunn?
Okay, and then,
Ms. Dunn, could we have Mr. Huckelberry respond to that question as well?
sure.
Yes, Mr. Chairman and Supervisor Miller, if you look at my August 1st communication, which is really a summary of the transmittal of Mr. Voorhees' report, on the second page of Mr. Voorhees' report, he documents the response and the discussion he's had with Worldview regarding the FAA.
Well, I understand that, but there's no documentation and there's no anything from the FAA. And it seems to me that when you report an incident to the FAA, they don't just blow it off. They have some sort of a response. So that's disturbing. And that is something that I think we need to continue to try to get. The other thing was the Arizona Division of OSHA. And I am referring to the July 31st, 2018 memorandum from you to Mr. Huckelberry. The Arizona Division of OSHA sent an investigator to investigate, and they said they had no findings. What exactly did they investigate? We had a hydrogen balloon that violently exploded. OSHA said there were no findings? Really?
Mr. Chair, Supervisor Miller, if I could back up to one of the earlier comments and then I'll address this one as well. In terms of the FAA's notification and their response, it is not uncommon for that whole process to take place via phone call based on my experience in the accident investigation world. I can also tell you that the Tucson Tower did notify the FAA as a result of the explosion the same day, just as Worldview did in accordance with their protocols. So they received at least 2 phone calls. The proof is in the pudding. They sent no investigator out. They did not forward that they did forward it to the NTSB, but the NTSB also did not send an investigator out. I think they believe that the loop is closed, but I can certainly contact Worldview to find out the specific person and see if there was any documentation. I didn't think it was germane at this point based on their lack of engagement in the investigation process.
Well, I just like something from them saying we believe it was an insignificant incident, and that might give a lot of people in the community some sense of calm. But if
Madam
there's
Supervisor.
nothing from them, then you're gonna leave it open for interpretation.
Very well, Madam Supervisor, and I'll take a look at that. Back to the Arizona Division of OSHA, they did not have any findings. Their task was to come out and interview employees regarding any illegal handling or mishandling of the incident scene, of the company's safety standards. In the aviation world, it's understood it's a relatively high-risk environment, and some things were going to happen that are accidents. This does not necessarily mean that there was malfeasance, mishandling, or any other issue that needed to be brought up within the incident investigation. So they could very well have no findings from an OSHA standpoint and consider it a safe operation, even though they did have this significant balloon explosion.
Okay, the other thing that concerned me about this report from these 3 consultants, they didn't put it on their letterhead and they did not sign the report. Is that standard when you have an accident investigation? It's on Worldview stationery, and it looks as if, I mean, there's nothing that's signed by them that says they did this investigation. It's on Worldview stationery. And it doesn't even really look like stationery to me. It's just a memorandum in a Word document, is what it looks like.
Mr. Chair, Supervisor Miller, I would say that the entire investigation is kind of non-standard because generally speaking, once the FAA, the NTSB, and OSHA finish their investigation process, the issue is closed. Worldview decided in the interest of their own self-improvement to do this investigation. There is no standard template for that. You probably did see the email that I sent to one of their staff members giving them some items to include in that investigation. That was really to help them because they had not had any safety incidents and they did not have any local expertise on how to conduct an investigation. So because there is no standard template, there is no letterhead, there is no way to do this, I try to kind of help them along. So it's not uncommon, I guess I would say, for them not to have put something on a specific letterhead and signed it. I don't think that that's necessarily telling into the investigation whether they endorse it or not. I believe they would probably give their full-throated endorsement of what they wrote in their own investigation. But I don't
Did
think
they write a
that's...
separate report that was then changed or sanitized in any way before what we got? Was there a separate report written by these engineers?
Mr. Chair, Supervisor Miller, I am actually not aware of whether there was a report or not. I encouraged them to write a report for their own internal use that would include all the proprietary information they needed to discuss that would not necessarily be appropriate in a public forum. I did require that they would have a publicly releasable document which they submitted to us. So I've never seen a second report. I made the assumption that there would be a separate report because if I were the company's owner, I would want them to do a very thorough investigation. But I know that they're very sensitive to the proprietary nature of their company, and therefore they may or may not have actually produced a
So
separate
we didn't
report.
get a separate report. This is the report we got. And then there
Supervisor
were,
Miller, again, could we let Chuck have a shot at this one?
Yes, I think, Mr. Chairman, Supervisor Miller, there's been some discussion, at least we even heard it publicly, that we somehow altered the report, the county did, and that
That's
there
what
was a
I'm
time
trying to
frame,
clarify.
and there was a time frame between when it's dated, that we received it, and when we released it. It was my decision to hold it until we had completed the ground inspection of the facility so that we could be assured that the facility was properly and completely repaired, that in my mind completed the investigation. And that was done about the day after our facilities management department did their final inspection of all the repairs. That's when the report was released, and it was not touched or altered by any county staff and myself.
okay, that you can see how those rumors get started. When people see documents that, I think this one came in May, and then it was just released in July. So that's how those things start, so that's good to clarify that. There were 6 findings by these 3 engineers that did the report, and I read through the report, and Finding number 6 on page 3 of the report states human factors such as excessive workload, crew rest rules, and realistic planning and scheduling processes need to be matured. Yet in the same report on page 4 of 9, it states in the last paragraph, the independent review team did not find that schedule, pressure, worker fatigue, and other related issues contributed to the incident. Which is it? These are conflicting in their report, 2 conflicting statements.
Mr. Chair, Madam Supervisor, it may be a little bit of a matter of semantics. What they're saying in finding number 6 was that overall in that company, that there are excessive workloads on some personnel and that there are necessary safety steps that need to be taken for human factors engineering in that company. But on page 4, they're saying that those were not necessarily causal in the mishap itself.
But they had that listed as a finding.
Yes, so a lot of times in a safety investigation, just like most open investigations, you will uncover other data related to the company's operation that bear significance and they bear further investigation. They may not necessarily directly relate to the incident at hand, but they can certainly be a safety factor. And in all safety investigation, the goal number 1 is mishap prevention. So I think that board was trying to tell Worldview that you do have some excessive workload issues. You do need to address human factors in your company, even though we have not seen a direct correlation to the mishap sequence that was involved on December 19th.
But in their finding, they said that it was an issue. Finding number 6, human factors such as excessive workload, crew rest rules, and realistic planning and scheduling processes. That's one of the findings.
Mr. Chair, Madam Supervisor, what they say is those processes are being matured and must be made rigorous for future operations. That doesn't necessarily say it's causal in the mishap.
Well, isn't
They
that
do
what
say
the
that it's
finding is?
not necessarily in the safety world in the nomenclature that they're using. If you look at the background of some of these individuals, and based on my own background, what you will find are, we use different terms. So there are findings, there are causal factors, there are contributing factors. They had a generic use of the word finding that might not necessarily mean what you and I would think it means when you're in an audit type of situation. So in this case, and I think I made that a statement like that in one of my prior memos, they have used the term finding, which some are factors, some are contributing factors, some are findings in and of themselves. What they're using as a finding here is an observation that there is a problem, not necessarily something that is causal in the mishap sequence.
Okay, but there is a problem there.
They
In
did
those issues,
stress that
and
there
then
was an
later
issue
on-
resolved, yes.
Okay. If we could get some clarity on that, that would be a good thing, just to get that clarified,
Yes,
what
ma'am.
exactly they meant. And then, the most troublesome thing to me was that on page 4, paragraph 9, it noted only some witness statements were taken, data collected but was not impounded, equipment used in the incident were not preserved, the balloon was put into a recycle. So they actually the review team actually had to look at similar hardware and similar balloon. They didn't get to look at the exact things that were used, materials that were used in this incident, which I've been involved in the aerospace industry. You always preserve the scene. That's the first thing you do, is make sure that it doesn't get contaminated. You make sure everything's preserved. And in this case, this is where I find OSHA kind of questionable, is some of the hardware directly involved in the incident was no longer available for the incident team to examine. That's on page 5 of the 9 pages, paragraph 5. The team doesn't believe there was any consequence of significance associated with that. How do they know? They don't know because they didn't examine the actual materials. That's just something that really stuck out, and that I would think an investigative team would have been real upset about, because they couldn't really examine the accident scene. On page 5 of 9 at the top, they state it was a mishap Class C. What is that?
In federal nomenclature, the mishaps categorization go through A to E. Class C would be a mishap of $500,000 or less of total destruction. So they're right at that margin of being a Class C mishap.
So this is just based on dollars.
Generally speaking, although Class A also invites if there are any fatalities involved or serious permanent disabilities.
You didn't participate in this investigation in any way, shape, or form, did you?
Mr. Chair, Madam Supervisor, no, I did not.
Okay. Were there any other payouts to any other entities besides Pima County? I know we got the checks and we endorsed them to give them to Worldview. Why? That's a question I have. Why would we endorse the checks and give them to Worldview when the property actually belongs to us?
Mr. Chairman, Supervisor Miller, we were co-insured, and we were named as part of the insurance policy, so therefore they're written to us, and we endorsed them to repair the facility.
But it's our facility. Why wouldn't we oversee the repairs?
We did.
Pardon me?
We did. That's why facilities management staff was doing final inspections.
Facilities management did the repairs at the facility? Okay.
Contractors did.
Okay, so they've been done, the Pima County oversaw them. Why didn't we pay the contractors directly? Why didn't we endorse the checks and give them to Worldview?
Contractors were employed by Worldview.
Okay. Got most of these answers. And are there any outstanding injuries for employees, or have all been cleared to go back to work? Is everything?
Madam Chair, Mr. Chairman, Supervisor Miller. The answer is no. And they're all basically cleared to go back to work the same day.
Was this the first balloon that Worldview used hydrogen? I understand it was tethered, it was not going to be launched or anything. Was it the first one they used with hydrogen?
Mr. Chairman, Madam Supervisor, that's correct. This was their first test of the hydrogen lift system.
Have they done another hydrogen test since then?
I'm not aware whether they've done another hydrogen balloon test or launch, but they have not done one at Spaceport Tucson.
Okay. And will they be launching another one or doing another test at Spaceport Tucson?
That is not known to me, Madam Supervisor. I do not have, as my memo said, there is nothing specifically restricting them from using hydrogen, but we have not made any, or they have not made any intimation whether they would use hydrogen at the site. They have no hydrogen on the facility, and they have not stated that they were going to use hydrogen in their next lift from Spaceport Tucson.
Okay. And this is something that has been ongoing that I never received an answer back on. Do they currently have FAA approval for the launch site or for their vehicles?
Mr. Chair, Madam Supervisor, the Worldview currently operates under Part, I believe it's 101, which is the company itself is legal or certified to fly off of Spaceport Tucson. Spaceport Tucson still needs to go through the Part 420 certification in order to allow other agencies who may or may not be certified yet to launch from our spaceport. They are legal to do what they are doing, but the spaceport itself does not have a certification. So
the spaceport has not been certified by the FAA, but the Worldview folks have been certified by the FAA to launch these balloons?
That is correct.
At that site? No?
Yes, they are allowed to launch from any suitable launch location. That could be at our Spaceport Tucson. That could be from an airport that gives them permission, anywhere where they can find suitable launch characteristics for their balloons.
Okay, and they have approval from the FAA to fill with hydrogen and launch hydrogen balloons.
Mr. Chairman, Supervisor, I'm not sure that the FAA actually regulates whether or not they can use a specific lift gas. I believe that all hydrogen, helium, and any other lift gas are available to them based on their certification.
Okay. And do we have a copy of the FAA certification? Because originally it was they have to get certification for the site and then they have to get certification for their particular vehicle. Do we have copies of those certifications?
I believe we do that, yes.
Can I get a copy of that?
I will look that up and send it your way, ma'am.
Okay, and then the biggest problem of all, I think, is that, on page 6, you said in the contract, the taxes, they are not paying the GPLIT. Is that still the case? They're exempt from the GPLIT?
Mr. Huckelberry?
Mr. Chairman, Supervisor Wheeler, there is a aviation exemption
Okay.
in statute.
And the biggest problem of all, in my opinion, is the fact that the contract only requires them to have $1 million per incident and $2 million in the aggregate, and that is in the contract. And I know, Mr. Huckelberry, you mentioned earlier that they had insurance of $3 million, but the concern is, we're lucky no one was killed in this incident. We're lucky that there wasn't an airplane in the vicinity, all kinds of things that could have happened. And I have $1 million of liability on my home. Why would we have it in the contract that they could have a liability, commercial liability of $1 million each occurrence on a facility that is launching highly explosive balloons?
Mr. Chairman and Supervisor Miller, what you see there is typically their standard language in our leasing documents, and so those are all minimums. And then as determined by the risk manager, then they are required to have very specific levels in these areas. I think that we communicated previously that their general liability insurance is $5 million per occurrence. And they have basically $3 million of personal injury, and this is general liability being per occurrence. The workman's compensation, which is pretty typical, is $1 million, and they're fully insured for the value of the building and the spaceport.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a liability because the contract only says $1 million per occurrence. Is there a way?
That's just our standard language in our leasing documents, and so you're always going to see that language because it's just one of the, because most of our leases are.
But that's the one that's signed that says that they have to have this. So how can we enforce anything higher on them if they can produce a contract that says, oh no, your requirement's only $1 million? Do we have something signed by them that requires them to have more? I don't even think $5 million is enough.
We required that, and that's what our risk manager feels is appropriate.
The risk manager, who's the risk manager? Do they have experience with hydrogen balloons? I mean, in the aerospace industry, you have to have really high liability insurance, and this is an experimental. A lot of what they're doing is experimental, obviously. For this accident to have occurred, we don't have a lot of experience.
Levels of insurance were basically reviewed by the risk manager who consulted with aviation risk manager and loss experts.
Well, I'll tell you why this concerns me so much. We had a gentleman who worked for Pima County who got in a bicycle accident and sued for $6 million. We settled for something less than that because it never even became a lawsuit. But that just shows you how woefully inadequate this insurance is. I know you think it's funny, Dr. Garcia, but it really isn't. It's a serious issue for the taxpayers of this community who will end up having to pay for it because we're not requiring adequate insurance. And this $5 million is not adequate in any shape or form. When you have a bicycle accident and the notice of claim was $6 million from a county employee, you can imagine what it would be if someone was killed when one of these balloons launches. And we don't even know if they're planning to do it again. Apparently they have every right to go out there and fill up with hydrogen again. Your February memo stated that the folks at Raytheon were very concerned about this. We just read that this morning before I came down here. I don't know how the rest of the board feels, and I'd like to hear how the rest of the board feels about the insurance aspect of this. I know this contract has been signed, but the insurance aspect, we could certainly, at least according to Mr. Huckelberry, we could certainly impose a higher level of liability insurance.